I'm the director of the Journalism Protection Initiative at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism in New York City. And I'm here with Jon Allsop, which is such a pleasure, so wonderful to be here with you. And I have a question to start with. Who in the journalism world does not start their day reading Jon Allsop? I can't think of anyone. I certainly do.
I can probably think of a few.
Maybe there are a few. But I think many of us in this room, that's kind of our morning routine. We read his newsletter, The Media Today, for Columbia Journalism Review. I also write for Columbia Journalism Review. We read his magazine pieces in The New Yorker and the New York Review of Books. But for those of us who can't get enough, we now have an entire book of Jon Allsop, which is an incredible treat. It's full of analysis about the media today, but also its past and its future, and it's called What is Journalism For?, which is an excellent, excellent question. And it's what we're going to talk about today. But I want to say that this is, the book launched this week, and this is the celebration. So we're so happy that all of you could be here with us today. And congratulations to Jon.
Thank you so much, and thanks everyone for coming.
So let's dive right in. My first question is as I mentioned, the book is called What is Journalism For?
Please don't ask me that.
Yes, I'm going to ask you that. But my question is really about the series. It's part of a series. Mm-hmm. It's published by Bristol University Press. Can you tell us a little bit about how it came about and why you decided to take it on?
Yeah, so I think like the answer that should be the case for why did you write a book called What is Journalism For? Is, you know, I sort of had the independent foresight to know that when it came out, it would be an incredibly existential and important question. I wanted to be sort of leading the intellectual cavalry on it. But actually, I was asked to write it, and the title is kind of, was actually handed to me. So I don't know, I think anyone here who's spent time in the UK will know the Oxford University Press very short introductions series, which are like these great small books that are sort of, you know, as the title says, a very short introduction to a whole range of topics. And the same editor who, you know, is the force behind that series has done a different series for Bristol University Press where the framing question is not like an introduction to something, which kind of implies, you know, an explainer, but what is the thing for, which implies more a kind of manifesto, statement of purpose argument. And yeah, he reached out to me and said, I read your work, and I think you'd be a good person to take on the journalism title in this series. Because there are loads, I mean, again, and some of them are quite specific, and some are, like mine, are much more general. So I think there's like, what are the Olympics for is one of them, what are prisons for, what is veganism for? And he asked me the journalism one, and you know, I said, I sort of went away and thought about it, and yeah, I think the sort of two reasons I wanted to take it on in the end were, like, firstly, very selfishly, I've always wanted to write a book, but, like, have not really had the time to, like, think of an idea for, you know, a sort of non-fiction book that's quite focused, and so this felt like a great opportunity to, you know, I've done a lot of long-form journalism, this felt like an opportunity to step beyond that. But secondly, yeah, obviously, you know, I've been writing about the media for CJR for now about 8 years. At the time it was, you know, five or six or whatever. And yeah, I just felt that I'd been sort of orbiting this question in a much less abstract way.
Were you like intrigued by the question itself? I mean, was this question you think about just on your own without a book editor telling you to think about it?
So no, I don't think it was actually. I think it was something where, you know, like what I write, this is very much implied in a lot of it. Right. And I realized, you know, sort of realized that. But actually, it wasn't like when I was asked, can you write this book, that I had sort of one very clear answer that I was like, I know I want to say this. You know, I really had to go away and think about it. But yeah, it was sort of a question that felt like, you know, I could write this book and it would sort of be a capstone.
I certainly felt as a reader, like, if I'm asking that question, you're the person I want to answer it. So that's a good fit. But let me ask you this. I mean, so the book sort of grapples with a lot of the big questions, or certainly that preoccupy people here, you know, about the sustainability and about, I mean, you don't really deal with AI much, but just like, you know, there are a lot of big existential questions that are kind of confronting the profession, but you sort of open and you keep returning to the experiences of journalists in Myanmar who are grappling with just the day-to-day challenges of being a journalist in a dictatorship. Why did you focus on their story? Why was it important to open with it and keep returning it into the context, in the context of these broader discussions that the book tackles?
Yeah, so I have sort of a weird perch because I am, as you'll be astonished to know, from England, but I did journalism school in the US. and basically sort of by complete luck continued to write for US publications. But I now live in London again, so I sort of have this like transatlantic thing going on where I'm quite focused on obviously those two countries, and I know a lot about their media ecosystems. And I think a lot of literature that is similar to this book or has a similar framing, is also quite US in particular centric, quite Western centric. And so I think it's important to say it's not like an academic book. It's not sort of like comparative studies or whatever. I don't claim that, by setting up Myanmar as a kind of contrary case, it sort of reveals some rigorous sort of scientific truth. But it was important for me to sort of write about something where I wasn't coming from scratch, because I'd written about Myanmar's media since the coup there in 2021 for CJR, but not in a huge amount of depth. So it was something where I knew enough about it that it would be an interesting sort of case study. I knew it would be worthwhile to pursue. But I also wanted to sort of like step out of my own comfort zone and sort of, I guess, like test some of my ideas in a different climate. And one thing that sort of, I think revealed itself to me while writing this is that like cross-country comparisons are actually like an incredibly limiting way to view journalism. And certainly journalists, who I had access to in Myanmar, which again, is sort of a limited sample because I am an English speaker. I don't speak, the sort of local languages there. But actually a lot of what they had to say would be completely consistent coming out of the mouth of an American journalist or a British journalist. But, there are also some differences. And the other part of it as well is, there's kind of two other parts of it quickly. One of them is that it's actually an incredibly interesting case study because it's not just like journalism existing under a dictatorship. It's journalism that existed under a dictatorship for a long time. And then they had this like 10-year period of sort of a transition towards democracy. I think you can debate whether they fully got there or not, but towards elections. And there was this incredible flowering of like press freedom that happened, but with some really sharp challenges. And then just kind of like like a light switch almost in February 2021, the military seized control, forced loads of journalists kind of back into exile. And so it's almost this kind of you can see this kind of real-time process of not just how does journalism work under dictatorship and those conditions, but how does it how does it sort of transition from one to the other quite recently. I also think, just very quickly, it's a country that has in the past been a kind of cause célèbre for the international democracy movement. I think everyone here has probably heard of Aung San Suu Kyi and sort of in the 2000s. I think it was really talked about quite a lot, is my understanding, by the international community. I think after the coup in 2021, that was the case, but the world is in crisis. There are conflicts everywhere, and I think this story is so important and has sort of fallen down the news cycle as well.
Well, I think that's definitely the case, and I think what it does do is it sort of grounds the book in sort of universalist themes, even if you're talking about the day-to-day challenges that journalists face in democracies. But I wanted to transition to that because that's one of the early chapters is about the relationship between journalism and democracy. That's the focus. So, and in that chapter, you kind of trace the origins of journalism from 17th century England, and you talk about the evolution of how journalism has evolved in tandem with democratic ideals. But in the end, you suggest that pairing journalism too tightly with democracy can reflect a Western bias. And here I want to quote from the conclusion of the book where you say, society needs journalism and an adequate number of professional journalists to fulfill key informational and critical roles on its behalf. Those roles are demanding enough without adding a duty to save the world. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, if you can give me like maybe 3 hours, we can.
Sorry, you don't have it. You got.
So I think there's two things here. I think with the democracy thing, it's become kind of a catchphrase in the age of Trump in particular to say that journalism is sort of about or should have a sort of duty to save or strengthen democracy. And I've definitely written that, certainly in unnuanced ways at times. Yeah. And I think the quote that you mentioned about how that can reflect a Western bias, I think was actually from a book that I cited. Which and basically it was just to say that it's not as simple as saying democracies have journalism and dictatorships don't, or the West has journalism and the rest of the world doesn't. Actually, journalism can, as we've seen, decline in countries that are democracies because it can't, float on the market as a kind of sustainable commercial business model. And equally, as the case of Myanmar shows, even in very, very difficult conditions, journalism can find a way to go forward. But I think, I also conclude that, like, journalism and democracy, it's not the core of the ideas is not necessarily the same, but they are a good pairing, I think, for reasons that will be obvious to people who are in this crowd, so I won't elaborate on that too much. The second part of what you said in my conclusion, I think, is like probably a really important point for me. I think that when I was sort of reading a lot of literature on this kind of question, I think you see sort of a tension between, especially in the US context, people who say, journalism, it's okay for journalists to go into a community meeting and sort of referee it or umpire it and sort of, help the community reach a compromise on an issue, or it's okay, for journalists to sort of be service providers or view their role in a quite expansive way. And I think you then have the criticism of that traditionally, which is like, that kind of gets you onto the playing field. That's not what journalism is about. It's unethical. I think where I come down is, I don't think it's unethical, actually. I think that, journalism is totally interleaved with the rest of human life, and, not just community as a kind of monolithic idea, but different communities that sort of populate this wider world. And I think that, if journalists feel like their mission is to referee a community meeting or, sort of help people access services, I think that's good. But I think my point is that it's not a journalist's job to do any of that. It's not incompatible with what journalism is for, but actually, what journalism needs to do is much more about kind of information provision and critical thinking. And I think my point is to say that in this moment of kind of institutional degradation, where all over the world it feels like democratic institutions are just doing a crappy job, feeling like, it's our duty to step into that void where governments are failing, where where good government groups maybe don't have the resources to cover everything. I think that can be an honorable feeling, but I don't think it is what journalism is actually for, and I don't think we therefore have a sort of philosophical, abstract kind of duty to do that. It is actually ancillary. Again, not unethical, but it's
I mean, I think this is where the whole grounding the book in the experience of journalists in Myanmar help give context to these questions, because whatever generalizations you make about the experience of journalists have to apply in the range of circumstances that you explore. But I want to get to another chapter, which happens to be my most underlined chapter, which is called Judgment. And if I can just boil down the fundamental question I think you're asking in this chapter, which goes to the broader points we're discussing now, is there a way of seeing and understanding the world that is fundamentally journalistic? Is there a way that journalists sort of engage with the world and with the reality that they experience, which is different from other forms of kind of intellectual inquiry, if you want to call it that?
Yeah, I think so. And so the reason the chapter is called Judgment is because it's the chapter that deals with this incredibly thorny yet very essential question of how do we determine what is true, right? And without wishing to get too, postmodern about it, it's actually very, very difficult for journalists to, and for anyone to sort of work out what a truth is. It sort of gets into this idea that, even if you tell a story that is very kind of objective in the old sense and sort of fact, you're going to choose the facts that go into the story. You've chosen to write the story in the first place, right? So you can't, there's no such thing as kind of the truth that just reveals itself and then you write it down. All of these things reflect, and Jay Rosen and others have made this point very eloquently, all of these things reflect a process of judgment, right? And I think, it sort of feels like a bit of a cop-out to say that judgment is this essential pillar of journalism, but I think, number one, it just is, and it can't be avoided, right? The journalists just do make judgment calls every day, and that's how they go about their jobs. But also, judgment is a thing that it's a quality that you can hone, right? Like some people might have better judgment than others just sort of innately, but if you work in a newsroom, you can learn news judgment, as we call it, right? If you listen to your sources and members of the community and don't allow sort of loud voices to sway you, but you take in feedback, that can sharpen your judgment as well. And so I see that as sort of one of these three pillars that form other chapters in the book as well, which are criticism and community. And sort of together, I think that journalists, to boil it down to the most kind of oversimplified slogan, I guess, judge what is true about the world, engage in a constant process of criticism of everything around them, which is not to say saying that things suck and are bad, not that form of criticism, but critical thinking, right? Always asking questions. And you do it on behalf of a community, not a monolithic idea of community, but it's always for somebody, even if that somebody is sort of, international coverage for the whole world. I think if you sort of do something that is in the spirit of those three things, then you are doing journalism, and I don't think that you therefore have to be working for a major news institution to be able to say that you are doing journalism, right? It can take many forms. And if I may, just quickly, I think what was important to me in this book was not to say TikTok is changing journalism in X, Y, and Z ways, right? Because, I might have written about deepfakes 5 years ago and how they were going to totally, denature everyone's understanding of reality. It hasn't really happened. I sort of wanted to try and boil it down to a core spirit that I think if you do it, and you sort of think in those ways, you can be a journalist at least some of
Right.
the time. And yeah, it's not.
But there are other modes of truth seeking that pertain to certain professions. I mean, the law, through the legal process, you seek to pursue the truth. Through the scientific process, you seek to pursue the truth. So journalistic inquiry is a kind of process that is distinct from the other two that I mentioned. What are the specific qualities, or what is the outcome that, in terms of seeking to understand what is true, that differentiates journalism from those other approaches?
Well, I think it's actually really messy. I don't think
Yeah.
there are necessarily clean lines between those things. I mean, someone writing an article for the New York Times and someone defending the New York Times against Sarah Palin's libel suit in court, you would say, well, one's a journalist, one's a lawyer. But there are gray areas, right? Like I was at this great panel earlier with Ben Horman from this great site, health news site, who I know a little bit. And one of the things they were talking about there was examples of work they had done where they were sort of using monitors outside people's flats in London. This was not Ben's site, but I think a different one. And they were sort of taking readings of temperature, and then they would go to the council with that, and the council would say, oh yeah, this is actually very hot, we should maybe do something about it. Stéphane Aurel, this amazing journalist from Le Monde, was talking about working with scientists, and I think had actually done something. See, Ben's here now. Didn't realize he was here when I started talking about him, not trying to curry favor. But yeah, they sort of worked with actual academics, and that, is that a work of science, or is it journalism, or is it both? So I just say this to say I don't think there are clean lines, and it might become a sort of case-by-case thing a bit. But obviously what journalists do is they sort of put this information into the public sphere, right? In a way that might not always be the case for, a lawyer's going to argue in front of a judge. A journalist is going to seek the widest possible public, or at least the widest possible public to which the thing they're covering is pertinent, and try and communicate that information to them. Yes, so it is, obviously it's different, but I don't think it's necessarily different in a way that's easy to schematize and sort of break down and say very clearly this is journalism and this is science. The world is, I think, messier than that.
Okay, I've got another easy question for you.
Shoot.
Okay, so this one is sort of a follow-up on that, and it's about power. And you suggest that journalists should accept in some form that they have limited influence over policy and the ability to kind of change things, and that they should not internalize their failure if some injustice that they expose persists. So do you see this, because you're raising it explicitly, as a problem within the profession? Is this something that journalists need to address in terms of the way they think about their role?
Yes, I do actually think it is. And look, I want to be clear, I don't spend my time writing grant proposals, but my understanding is that a lot of funding for journalism is tied to quite a narrow definition of impact, right? And I've had to answer sort of, write references for people where it's what was the impact of their work? And I always kind of struggle with that question because, yeah, sometimes you can point to examples of again, this piece of journalism was done about heat, about the temperature in buildings in London. We went to the council, they changed it. And I want to say that is great. I'm definitely not saying that it's not journalism's job to do that. It's great when it happens. In the 1970s, the Washington Post can report Watergate, and the president eventually resigns. Now, this is an incredible sidebar, but actually, there are many ways that Watergate could have played out where Nixon didn't end up resigning. This idea that the Post kind of forced him to is totally oversimplified. But there was an accountability mechanism, a chain. Journalism was a key part of it. He went. There's been a gazillion Watergates or worse about Donald Trump. And he says, actually, no, I'm not going to resign, and also you're fake news, right? Does it mean that the pieces of journalism about Trump were worse than the Watergate reporting? No, of course not. It means that we live in a climate where he thinks he can just brazen it out. And that the difference between the two is not remotely in the control of journalists. We cannot control it. And so I think impact is great, but I think saying to, especially smaller newsrooms and one serving, kind of war-torn countries from exile or whatever, you have to prove some kind of demonstrable impact in circumstances where there are just no accountability mechanisms in order for us to give you money, I think is completely insane. The impact of journalism is to provide people information and to think critically about the world around them, and that is not a small thing. It's again, we've discussed it, it's hard to sort of pin down exactly what it means sometimes, but it's not a small thing. And if I may, the book was written before the election in the US, and I think that was actually, I was kind of worried about it, but I think it was actually good, because I think it led me to sort of de-center Trump as a character a bit, in hopefully a way that, someone reading it in 10 years might appreciate. But you see so much discourse after the election that's or at least some discourse that's journalism had no power here, right? Because Trump got elected, we told the country what a threat he is, what a fascist he is, whatever, and people still voted for him. And my response to that is, you can't control how people vote. And the idea that someone who, you know, feels that Biden has ruined the economy or whatever, didn't take into account any of your reporting because they didn't vote purely based on that, I think is wrong, right? People make decisions based on a combination of public information and their self-interest, and that's okay.
And their community, of course.
Correct. Also, you know, Trump's been very successful at this, going around sort of like behaving as if he won 75% of the vote. He won less than half. He won a plurality of the popular vote, which is, you know, obviously legitimate and everything, but like the idea that sort of your journalism was pointless because people didn't act on it in a way that you think they should, I think is just totally wrong-headed. So I think,
self-defeated.
Yeah, and I think we need to get away from thinking in those terms. I saw a great quote from Michael Sokolow, who's this amazing media historian in the US, and I think it was something along the lines of, in the aftermath of the election, it was like, journalists need to get better at thinking about what they do as a good end in itself and not worrying about how it sort of, you know, echoes through the rest of the process. And I totally agree with that.
Okay, I have a couple more, hopefully we'll get to a couple more questions, but I just want to say right now that for those of you who are excited to talk with Jon further and to get a copy of the book, you're going to be standing outside and you've got cards with a discount code that you'll be handing out. So if you want to talk more to Jon and you want to get a copy of the book, you should go outside and meet him there. But I want to ask you, as a follow-up to that, the really important point that you made to talk a little bit, to ask you, so I had a chance to interview Betsy Reed, who's the editor of the Guardian US at a forum here on Thursday, and that whole discussion was about how to cover Trump, and I'm not going to summarize it here, but you had a chance to be there, I think, or I've told you a little bit about it, but I wonder if you could answer that question based on your, you know, the research and the thinking that you did in you know, producing this book. How would you answer that question?
I have written, I mean, I think the defining question of my sort of like early journalistic career has been how to cover Donald Trump. I've written about this from every angle, up to and including like, how does his language, like Little Marco or Lion Ted, kind of echo the tropes of fairy tale storytelling, right? So we're pretty like deep into some stuff that might be questionable here. But you know, I think I wrote a lot about this because I was, you know, like many observers, very frustrated over the years seeing US news organizations try and sort of like squeeze Trump through like the normal prism of the way they cover politics, when clearly he is that's not only inappropriate, but he is actually an affront kind of to that. He is sort of an assault on that process. I think now the way I see it is actually, you know, again, I'm sure there are many, many examples of journalism every day where I'd say, I don't like the framing of that. You know, I don't think the top story today should be, you know, a judicial election in Wisconsin and what it means for 2026. Like, I think this is totally indulgent and rubbish and I hate it. But like, fundamentally, actually, I see journalists in the US now, I think, you know, at least through the prism of what I'm reading in their work, understanding mostly what is going on, doing some amazing coverage of it, going into the agencies and speaking to people who have lost their jobs because of Doge. I think by far the more important question now is, are the people who own those publications and who manage them willing to stand up when the going gets tough? Because I think we're seeing some evidence that they're not. So in some ways, to come back to the way you put the question, you know, I think this is not a book about media ownership, and I say that up front. You know, you could write a gazillion books about that. This is not what it's about, but at some point, you know, that becomes the defining question. But you know, I just think that with Trump the whole time, and it comes back to what I was saying before, actually, I think there are you know, liberals on social media who get very angry at journalism about Trump not convincing people not to vote for him. For me, that's never been the point. I think partially because I'm from the UK, so it's not, you know, it's not really my business in a sense, but you know, it's really about, are you telling the truth about him in the best way you can? And again, that involves judgment and involves critical thinking, and it's going to be a case-by-case thing. I don't think there's like an overarching guide to like how to do it. But if you are feeling like you're pulling punches, or you're using language to describe him, or framing, or proportionality, because that's what you traditionally have done, or that's what you would do for other candidates, no, you gotta look at what he's doing, and you've got to judge what the truth of it is, what the danger of it is, what the importance of it is, and you've just got to say it. And I think it's really that simple.
Okay,
honestly.
Journalists in the room, you've just gotten your marching orders. So I have one more question for you.
Okay.
And it's kind of pulling back and asking you a big one, but I hope you'll answer it briefly. So you say in your introduction that the question of what is journalism for needs an answer or answers, and that those cannot be so subjective as to lose all meaning. Why?
Because, like, you know, Russia might say it's a democracy because it has elections, but it's not, right? So I think that you can't turn around and say, this is journalism, and actually it's just a complete pack of lies and disinformation, but it's journalism because we say it is. I mean, that would be pure subjectivity. That's really all I mean by that. You know, it's, you can't sort of say that black is white. Obviously, that's like an offense against journalism in the sort of most basic way. But the point actually is sort of probably more on the flip side of the quote that you read. It's really that journalism is a very flexible concept. It's very expansive. It was important to me to be very transparent in the introduction that this is my answer right now, you know, and that if I wrote this book again in 10 years, and certainly if I wrote it 10 years ago, it would be completely different. And that I think as long as you sort of act in accordance with the principles that I think are the spirit of journalism, you don't have to like have a press pass or work for the New York Times or even agree on what journalism is. It's a huge, expansive world. And I think it's important to recognize that, because I think that actually starts to get towards answering some of these questions about relevance and new audiences and things we don't have time to go into. The point about the subjectivity is really to say that there are obviously many, many actors at the moment who are weaponizing that sense of open-mindedness to say, we are telling pure lies, but actually it's journalism because we say it's the truth. And you know, that's just a thing where you have to draw the line against that.
Okay, thank you so much, Jon Allsop. What is journalism for? Congratulations. We're so excited for the book. And please, nice round of applause for Jon and those who want to speak further.
Thank you so much.
Can meet him outside. Thank you again, Jon. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay.